Hey, how's it going, guys? This is your boy Hazzed, and today on the Battle for Azeroth Beta, we're going to be discussing Unholy DK single target DPS, as they did another raid testing here on the beta for another heroic raid boss, and we've actually downed him surprisingly, and the boss fight lasts for around 8 minutes, which is pretty insane for a boss fight. So we'll go ahead and roll that clip and just jump into this video.
And the Uldir defense system.
Dude, that like soaks right through me. Yeah, pick me up. Yeah. You still got that B-Res? He's almost dead though. 4 million health.
But he's not doing a tank debuff, right?
Yeah, I've not seen no tank debuff. Not the journal did say, I'll read it when we get. There's a spot where I'm supposed to taunt. That's how the hell they. Oh, just res me after he's dead. I just got smacked by his that backlash. Cudgel gore dead.
What's first? What's first?
But it's alright, 'cause right now we're frozen.
I wanna forget mistakes that helped me make. It's better to be broken than to break.
So let's start off talking about talents, because on the Mythic video that I posted the other day, there was a lot of questions as to why I was running All Will to Serve, because a lot of players think it's garbage, which from a Legion point of view, it would definitely not be something I would be playing with. But this is not Legion, guys. We need to understand how much stats we actually lost, like the off stats. Now, I'm pretty Mythic geared out. I'm 333 item level, full Mythic is 340. So if you look at my stats, I've got 12% crit, 11% haste, and only 36% mastery, and I got quite a bit of versatility for a DPS. I need to get rid of a lot of that. But the one thing you got to remember right now is there's a lot of downtime in single target DPS for Unholy, like a ton, especially in raid fights. And if you noticed at the end of that 8-minute raid fight that we had, DPS was only around 4 to 5k after that long. You know, you add in mechanics and a couple other things, and it's gonna drop DPS by quite a bit. Now, the one thing I gotta say is All Will to Serve is fairly good DPS at the moment because of off stats being so low. We're more based on ability damage than overall rotation, as we would be comparable to Legion, which is definitely overall damage as a rotation instead of relying on popping abilities at certain points and relying on certain abilities for certain damage. So the reason I'm running All Will to Serve is this little guy surprisingly does about 400 to 500 DPS on average, which is fairly strong for a little ad. If you think about that raid fight on that boss, you take this little guy who deals 400 to 500 DPS and you add in an 8-minute long fight in comparison to getting one boil or whatever you want to call it from Infected Claws, which does really good. If I was going to do a normal dungeon that had a lot of cleave, I would definitely spec into this and just go insane AoE. But if I was doing mythic dungeons or raid at the moment, because of the low off stats, I would be taking all will to serve because I'm relying more on either overall DPS, like in a raid situation, or in mythics at the moment. There's priority targets you have to kill, otherwise they're either going to kill you or they're going to kill your tank. So that's why I go all will to serve, to increase my overall consistency single target DPS. And surprisingly, overall consistency seems to be the major problem for Unholy DK at the moment. I wouldn't say major problem, but I would say it's the weakest leg of their DPS, comparable to burst DPS and AoE DPS, that we have AoE for days. We barely have to spec into it. If you take Epidemic, you've got AoE forever. If you take Ebon Fever, you've got a ton of AoE. You take Defile and Bursting Swords, you got a ton of AoE also. But I also tested out Defile, which turned out in the level 90 category is the best single target for overall DPS in like an 8-minute long fight, especially with a lot of mechanics you can drop in to run away and deal TPS while still, getting away from the target. It turned out to work pretty well. Epidemic, if there's a lot of AoE in the fight, but obviously the fight I tested earlier was complete single target DPS. Apparently there was supposed to be ads in the fight somewhere that somebody was saying, but there wasn't, so I don't know what's going on with that. But yeah, the best thing that I found out for elongated single target was going to be Defiled. I tried out Corpse Explosion, which did give me a little bit more burst damage up front, but in an elongated fight like that, it was definitely Defile coming out on top. But if I was going to run a Mythic, I would still be running Epidemic, just because I want that consistent AoE for a lot of the ads, because it's really strong in the AoE situations. So that's the reason I was running all will to serve, is because yeah, he's just like a basic consistent DPS spec that or talent you can go into right now, since we have such low stats. And I just rely on him to keep my DPS up, as you could see in that video, my DPS was ahead of the other Unholy DKs who weren't using it by quite a bit at the end of the fight. And I was keeping up with a lot of the range classes. I don't think there was actually a melee anywhere near me in terms of DPS during that fight, because a lot of my damage playing the dot spec and of course using all will to serve, I was able to deal pressure as I was running around the room fairly easily without relying on hitting the target nearly as much as Infected Claws would have me do, or I could have been using Clawing Shadows and doing a little bit more range pressure, obviously. Didn't think about that one too much during that raid fight. I didn't test that out. That might make a change, but more than likely, as of right now, all will to serve is actually fairly good, because you got to remember how much we were pressurized and scaled down, how much gear we technically lost when it came to scaling up of off stats. So yeah, I also tried out Summon Gargoyle, which Summon Gargoyle does not work nearly as well as Unholy Frenzy, because this ability with the 20% haste is fairly strong, and it also allows you to use Apocalypse if you're lucky enough to grant yourself 3 wounds off of a Festering Strike, and that procs once. You can hit Apocalypse one attack earlier, which grants up a lot of burst. You can hit above 15-16k at the moment in the gear set that I'm wearing, single target burst damage, which is quite high for single target. Like, that's really high for single target. And also you got to pop army and stuff like that. Now, the thing I don't kind of like about Unholy, but I mean, we got to do it with the global cooldowns, is how much pre-pop time you got to have. You got to start at about 5 seconds, because you got 3 seconds to pop your Army of Dead, and then you got to hit your Dark Transformation, and then you got to go into Unholy Frenzy and do your normal DPS. Now, you see, the only pet I have right now out is my Skulker, because I killed my other pet, and I was doing a lot of DPS testing with this little guy. And come to find out, so our highest DPS overall in single target is our melee attack, just our basic overall melee attack. And that really got me thinking about talents and stuff and how they're working out, because if our melee attack's that strong, our other abilities aren't nearly as important as just raw damage. So that was the other thing I wanted to test out with him, and that little guy actually turned out to deal melee versus Skulker damage, about 30% of my melee damage, which is the top damage, which turns the Skulker into about, I believe it was like 5th or 6th in all my DPS abilities for a single target fight. So if you guys are curious of why I was doing that in the Mythic dungeon, boss fights are literally the hardest thing in Mythic dungeons. Like everything else, the ads are fairly easy to get through. I mean, you might die a couple times, but you just come back, reburst on them harder, and then progress through the dungeon. But overall, yeah, let's go ahead and get into some DPS. I'm going to show you guys how I'm procking up that like 15k, 16k single target DPS on an Unholy DK. And during the start of the fight, I was definitely topping the charts in terms of opener burst DPS. So let's go ahead and get into that. First thing we're going to do is pop Army of the Dead. I'm going to hit my Blood Fury, which is going to be an extra second for me as an orc because it's going to give me a little bit more burst. And then I'm going to proc up Dark Transformation and then hit Unholy Frenzy. I'm going to apply my dots and I'm going to go in using Festering Strikes and spamming Scourge Strikes to burst any boils on the target and prioritizing Death Coil for single target over my other abilities since it hits quite a bit harder. And also I've got macros going on causing my little ghoul here to claw anytime I attack or anytime he gets enough energy to go in on the target. So let's go ahead and start on this. We're gonna pop Army of the Dead like we were talking about. We're gonna hit Blood Fury as soon as we can afterwards. We're gonna slap on Dark Transformation and then we're gonna hit Unholy Frenzy, and that's when we start in on the target. And we got Apocalypse up very soon there, and we're gonna go ahead and start dropping some big Death Coils on the target and prioritizing that over the other abilities because Death Coil hits so much harder. As you can see there, I didn't see how high my DPS peaked to at the moment, but I do see we're currently keeping over 16k DPS and just destroying the target. Now I let my dots fall off there for a little bit. Do not let your dots fall off. That's a terrible habit. But as you can see, guys, this DPS is pretty insane for Unholy DKs. Now, it will drop quite a bit, down to where a lot of the other classes' consistency is, but as you can see, generally when it comes to overall mechanics and things that you have to do quite a bit during the fight, if I have to move around, run away from the target, run over here, I can put my ghouls on it and I'm running away, and he's still shooting the target. This little guy's still going at it. He's dealing almost as much DPS as my plague damage when I'm at range. So if I'm over here, I'm having to run around, I'm having to drop bloods, kind of like I was in that video. He's still dealing quite a bit of overall consistency pressure and almost adding an extra dot to the target to keep up my DPS a lot more than it would if he wasn't over there in elongated fights. And of course, if we're up close, he just adds extra DPS to the situation. Now I did test out, like I said earlier in the video, I tested out Infected Claws in the single target, and it did give me a slight bit more burst overall since I could rely on Scourge Strikes over Festering Strikes for DPS to get a little bit more runic power faster. But all it did was give me a bit more upfront burst in the single target category and not nearly as much overall DPS, especially having to apply and fight through mechanics during the fight. So that's the kind of the thought process behind that, why I switched over from using Infected Claws into All Will to Serve, is because for the majority of the time you're going to be struggling on boss fights and mythics at the moment when trying to gear up through them. And I'm pretty geared as an Unholy DK. I do an insane amount of damage in AoE situations. We're talking, if there's like a big group of ads, 20 to 30k DPS. If it's only 3 ads like in mythics, because you can only pull, you know, small groups in mythics, otherwise your tank's gonna get one shot by something like an enforcer in freehold, or like that guy that was shooting lightning in that last video that just was one-shotting, or not really one-shotting, but he did a lot of DPS. He killed me. He killed me quite a few times. That guy was kind of evil. So I hope you guys enjoyed this little single target update video on how to do some of that Unholy DK stuff, because I said I had to do quite a bit more testing on it because I wasn't 100% sure straight after the revamp. A lot of the stuff seemed very confusing, and with everything being changed around like that, I mean, obviously something was going to change with the class quite a bit. And I feel like it was definitely a change to buff up our AoE. Our AoE got really buffed up. Our single target DPS really stayed the same, but we have a lot more burst up front, and we have a lot more burst overall with the implementation of Apocalypse. So I hope you guys enjoyed this update. Leave a like if you did. Leave a comment down below if you have any more questions, or you have builds you want me to try out in you know, mythics, situations like that. Let me know down in the comments below. And until next time, this was your boy Hazzed.